Hi there.
Great to be with you.
Nice to be with you.
I guess the Middle East is the kind of the gift that keeps on giving for people like us. There's always some upheaval to discuss.
Indeed it does. In any case, just to introduce myself, Stephen, I'm Ussama Makdisi, professor at Rice University in the Department of History.
And that makes me Stephen Kinzer. I teach international relations here at Boston University.
So what's your take, Stephen, as to what's going on in Tunis and in Tunisia and across the Arab world at this point?
I really don't see this as the beginning of some prairie fire. I think it could have some results eventually, but that could be a long time. The Tunisia situation was a little bit specific, and I would use an analogy, and that is that Iran erupted in 2009 after the election, and certainly at least the videos of that protest were spread all over the Muslim world, but it didn't prompt anyone else to explode. And I think part of the reason is that Iran's problems have to do more with Iran, and it doesn't necessarily spread. Now, that said, I'd say that if I'm wrong about this, and if there is going to be a place where there might be some unexpected eruption, and I had to choose where that would be, I think I might say Egypt. Egypt is, of course, a much more important and potentially influential country than Tunisia. Traditionally, one of the major leaders of the Arab and Muslim worlds, and they're facing a moment of potential crisis with the succession process. So we have this sense that, first of all, Egyptians don't protest, which I think is kind of outmoded. We don't know whether they protest. That's a stereotype from 25 years ago. And a whole new generation has emerged. I wonder if people in Egypt are willing to go along with the pharaoh succession as it has been planned, or whether this Tunisia thing might be giving some people ideas. So I guess my general take is I don't expect a wave of these kinds of uprisings, but they do plant a seed, and if there's a place where that seed could flower in a very dramatic way, potentially it could be Egypt within a year and a half when this crisis possibly emerges.
Yeah, I guess what I've been struck with so much in terms of the reaction to these events and to this revolution in Tunisia has been the incredible sort of eagerness with which Arabs across various Arab states, and as you said, each state of course has its own traditions, its own history, its own context, but there is a tremendous enthusiasm for the possibility and the fact of change and positive democratic change in an Arab country, in a region which is rife with dictatorships, with unrepresentative regimes, with foreign occupation in the U.S. in terms of what's going on in Iraq, in Afghanistan, further east, Israel and its occupation of the Palestinians. It's just this real desire for change, as well as you mentioned in Iran as well. So hopefully, I mean, of course, none of us can predict what's going to happen, but hopefully we're looking at a positive change.
Well, let me ask you this. In Iran, a country that I watch pretty closely, one big problem that green movement had was that the opposition that exploded after the election result was announced had neither a coherent program nor coherent leadership. Do you see either of those things in Tunisia, or is that a weakness in that movement and potentially in other places like Egypt as well?
Well, I think in Tunisia, I mean, I think that there are interesting parallels between Tunisia and Iran. In Iran, my sense, of course, is that in Iran, not only did you have a contested election and from most accounts, obviously, a regime which manipulated the results of the election, but you also have, ultimately, you have two major sort of constituencies, pro-regime, anti-regime in Iran. Whereas in Tunisia, it was very clear that there was overwhelming antipathy to Ben Ali, the president of Tunisia, overwhelming antipathy to his regime, to his family's rule, to the corruption of the regime, and to the henchmen of this regime. And I think in that sense, I think Ben Ali and Tunisia and the example of Tunis and Tunisia is very much indicative, I think, of the state of various Arab regimes. And I think one of the strengths of the revolution in Tunis and Tunisia is the fact that it was so spontaneous. And I think it's very hard right now for us to predict and to figure out who's going to come out on top ultimately. It's very clear that the old guard, the Ben Ali's regime in Tunisia are trying desperately to hold on to power, but it's also clear that there's tremendous disaffection with any remnants of the regime in Tunis.
Now, in Iran, I think a couple of factors emerged that turned the corner and determined the result of that protest movement. First is that the security forces are deeply vested in the status quo. They have to maintain this regime, otherwise they lose everything. And secondly, the security forces have made some kind of a decision in Iran. They're willing to do whatever it takes, even if it means firing indiscriminately into crowds of protesters. That didn't seem to be the case in Tunisia. Now, what about other Arab countries? Would you say that, taking Egypt as an example, the security forces are so vested in the status quo that they will defend it to the death and that they're even willing to shoot their own countrymen as they were in Iran? Or do you see the Arab regimes having a weakness in this area?
Well, again, it's hard to predict as to what's going to happen in each country, but I mean, presumably the same applied in Tunisia, in the sense that the security regime, which has been part and parcel and the basis of Ben Ali's dictatorship in Tunis and Tunisia, has been the basis of this regime, and so presumably they had a vested interest in maintaining his power and therefore their power in Tunisia. But that didn't happen. Ultimately, the security apparatus fell apart and the army stepped in. So the question is, in Egypt, I assume, without again knowing the details of the security apparatus in Egypt, but my assumption is in Egypt, as in virtually every other state in the region, the security apparatuses are all vested in the status quo. And ultimately, what Tunisia and the Tunisian revolution shows is that when confronted with overwhelming popular anger, there is, ultimately very little these security apparatuses can do. Yes, they can fire into crowds, but ultimately there is a tremendous power in protest and in demonstration. And I think the question is, will you have a series, a confluence of events that will actually allow this kind of obvious discontent that you see, seething discontent with the status quo in the Middle East, in the Arab world in particular, with unrepresentative, corrupt, and mostly, of course, Western and U.S.-backed regimes. Will there be some kind of change, and will people be eventually be able to exercise self-determination? That, I think, is what we have to see.
Well, what I ask myself is this. We know what the revolutionaries, if you want to call them that, in Tunisia are against. But do we know, or do they even know, what they're for? What comes next? Is this movement just very inchoate and only a rebellion against something? Or do you think it has or can develop some kind of a focus?
Well, I think it's pretty clear. I mean, they're for freedom, and they're for, freedom, not in the George Bush kind of freedom, but freedom as in self-determination and an ability to actually imagine and live a future, a dignified present and future. And right now, across the Arab world, as you know, you have these unrepresentative regimes. You have, as I said, the Israeli occupation of the Palestinians and the humiliation and oppression of the Palestinians. You have the American presence and occupation. You have and of course, above all, you have these absurd dictatorships, including Muammar Gaddafi in Libya, who of course condemned the Tunisians for their uprising against Ben Ali's regime. And so I think what you have is this basic determination, a thirst for freedom, which you see represented in various forms, secular, as is the case apparently in Tunisia, but also Islamic visions and forms of liberation. And the question is, in this particular context, who's going to ultimately come out on top? I'm not sure. I mean, in Iran in '79, of course, there were also many different movements that were opposed to the Shah, deeply opposed to the rule of the Shah's dictatorship. But ultimately, as we know, alas, one form came out on top ultimately.
Well, this raises to me a larger question, and that is about democracy and its prospects in the Arab world. we could never have imagined 10 or 20 years ago that you'd see a democratic Poland, democratic Brazil, democratic South Korea. All of these things have come to pass, but the Arab world is the place where that democratic train has not stopped. The United States has always and still is afraid of democracy in the Arab world. We don't want it, and the reason that we fear it is that we're afraid if there's democracy, that will produce some kind of an Islamist alternative. Now, how realistic do you think that fear is? I don't expect the United States to change its policy overnight. It's actually worked pretty well in maintaining the kinds of leaders that we like. But do you think that if democracy is introduced in Tunisia and other Arab countries, we would see not just regimes that are less friendly to the United States and more sympathetic, for example, to the Palestinians? I think that's a given. But do you think we would also see regimes with an Islamist bent?
Of course, it depends on which elections we're talking about. But I think it's important to sort of, I think, qualify what you said. I mean, it's true that it's clear, of course, to any sort of observer or listener to this broadcast that there are no real representative regimes in the Arab world. You basically have either secular dictatorships or you have monarchies. In any case, one family rule is the norm. The question as to why there has been, you said there's no democracy train in the Arab world, and I think that's because it's been sabotaged both by external factors. I mean, let's not forget, it's the Europeans who came in and partitioned this part of the world after World War I, set up states based largely on sectarian and ethnic rationales in many instances, or sort of various sort of princely, various kingdoms or puppet states. And also you've had military regimes that have taken over, in other words, internal factors as well, and you've had the Arab-Israeli conflict, all of which have come together to basically asphyxiate what was clearly there at the turn of the 20th century, which was a democratic yearning, self-determination, something you saw not just, I should say after World War I, something that you saw not just in the Arab world, but you saw in India, you saw across many parts of the world. And so, you know, and I don't think the U.S., I mean, you're absolutely right, Stephen, the U.S. has been opposed to genuinely democratic elections in the Arab world, in large, not so much because they're afraid of an Islamist alternative, because in many instances, the U.S. is completely content, obviously, with the Wahhabist rule in Saudi Arabia, right, which is an Islamist regime. The U.S. has been content in the 1950s. It was content with Islamic opposition to secular Arab nationalist regimes. And in your own book on Iran, of course, you know about the U.S. opposing Mossadegh's rule in Iran, and in fact overthrowing Mossadegh in Iran in 1953. Not because they were afraid of Islamists, but because they were afraid of secular nationalist movements. Today, I think you're right. I mean, they're afraid. It's not again. They're not afraid of Islamists. They're afraid of genuine self-determination, which may go against U.S. interests, and that's what they fear more than anything else. Representative regimes that will actually voice the aspirations of people, which may not be coincidental with American desires.
Well, that's a very interesting point, that actually the United States really doesn't care where a regime is on the spectrum from completely secular to completely religious. It just matters how strongly that regime is going to support U.S. goals in the Middle East.
Or how subservient it is to, yeah, so how
That's
subservient
another way
it is
of
to the
putting
US.
it, yeah. I always like this phrase, the Israeli blockade of Gaza, when actually that blockade would be totally ineffective if Egypt were not an equal partner.
Yeah, I mean, so what you have in the Middle East right now is you have on the one hand, all on one side you have the United States, which has at one level hegemony over many of the regimes in the region, in the sense that the Saudis and the Jordanians and Egypt, of course, and Israel are all on one side. So we're talking about dictatorships, as well as, in the case of Israel, an incredibly repressive regime vis-a-vis what Israel does to the Palestinians, all on one side, against, on the other hand, popular movements, intifadas, which regimes like Iran manipulate to a large extent, sustain to a certain extent, as well as Syria. So it's an amazingly tragic, I think, period for the Middle East up until this revolution in Tunisia. And the hope is that this is going to be a spark for something positive and better.
I think there is legitimate hope for that, but we still don't have a model for what that would be. Arab nationalism essentially was a failure. These pro-American regimes also have failed to master public support. So we don't really know where we're going from here. And I think maybe that is the challenge for the leadership in these counter elites in Arab countries, is to try to shape something that would be domestically palatable, that's a real local form of democracy. I see also that this is something the United States has faced in so many different situations and in many different parts of the world. That is, we always want to find leaders in our allied or subservient countries who fill two criteria. You want a guy who's popular, that can have the support of his people and stay in power, and you also want somebody who'll do what we want. But very quickly, you realize you can't have both. You got to choose, because a person who is going to place the interests of the United States ahead of the interests of his own country is not going to be popular. So you have to choose. Do you want a leader who's popular, or do you want one who's going to do what you want? And that's an easy choice for us. We always choose somebody who's going to do what we want, whether or not he can be popular. And it seems to me what we're seeing now is the end result, the logical result of that kind of policy.
Yeah, I mean, but of course, the question is, what are the costs of this kind of policy? So we've had this policy where we have, or I shouldn't say we, the United States government has as you say, has sustained unrepresentative, incredibly cruel regimes across the region, whether they're secular, whether they're Islamist, whether in the case of Israel, a Jewish state, and all these regimes together have worked in tandem to sort of suppress self-determination on the part of most Arabs. And the costs are pretty clear. The liberalism has been effectively demolished in the Arab world. The democratic experimentation has been brought to a halt. Now, again, President Obama came out with a very sort of a positive statement on Tunisia, but after the fact. I mean, what's remarkable about the revolution in Tunisia is how little the U.S. Or the Europeans or any other state actually played in fomenting this revolution. This was genuinely a grassroots movement. So I'm not so scared as to what is going to appear when you actually have the voice of the people coming through. I think that's far more liberating in a sense, and far more positive than having the Arab world that you see today, which is incredibly, debilitatingly corrupt and tyrannical. And I think that allied with Israeli repression of the Palestinians, when those two factors end, I think then we'll see a much more positive, healthy development in the region, both for Arabs and for Israelis, for that matter.
Now, what do you see about the geopolitics of the region? Do you sense Iran rising as a kind of regional hegemon? Do you see Turkey with its very different model being a country that some of the Arab nations would want to copy in terms of more open democracy and relatively secular rule? Are there examples around the periphery of that region that you think would be guideposts for some of the people that are now rising up in Tunisia and perhaps elsewhere?
Well, I mean, again, it's a process that's in flux, and we'll wait to see. I think what's interesting to me and what's remarkable to me is, and maybe you can comment on this, Stephen, is how little coverage there was of the Tunisian revolution in the 4 weeks leading up to the actual deposition when Ben Ali fled the country. There was remarkably little coverage here in the New York Times and in various newspapers of record here in this country, as opposed to Al Jazeera in Arabic, which was following these events from basically the moment when Bouazizi sort of burnt himself in protest. You've had this incredible sort of coverage in Arabic and seen across the Arab world, and here very little coverage, and in fact it's already off the front page. The front pages of most papers. How do you explain that? I mean, there's very little sympathy here, and this is, I think, one of the tragic sort of aspects of this. There's very little sympathy or understanding of sort of basic Arab people's aspirations for freedom and self-determination. And I'm wondering how you, as opposed to, for example, the coverage of Iran, which was far more positive and sustained.
That's a very interesting question. Maybe it has to do with stereotypes in the United States of Arabs. It's like that famous line from the Jack Nicholson movie at the end, "Forget it, Jake, it's Chinatown." In other words, this is going on all the time. It's a cycle. It's nothing new. There's a maybe inbred skepticism for what's going on there. But you're absolutely right. As far as American newspaper readers know, this protest just began on the day that Ben Ali fled. We didn't know anything about it. Now, I do notice that some Arab countries, Kuwait and a couple of others, are moving actively now to ban Al Jazeera because they don't want their people to see these kinds of demonstrations. And it shows, I think, what an important role Al Jazeera played in breaking that media monopoly in that part of the world. So I feel that we always think of a place like Tunisia as being on the periphery. Nothing there can be really important. And this just shows limitation of American imagination. Excuse me, but I would say one other thing. We have lost a lot of foreign correspondents. There's just not enough people to go to places like Tunisia. And this is an example of what happens as a result of that process.
Yeah, but I think also you're absolutely right. But I think also there's this problem of sort of sensationalizing. I mean, following, for example, the issue of self-immolation, that you see now, you saw in Tunisia, or we at least heard about and read about in the case of Tunisia. We read about sort of copycat cases in Egypt and other places, Mauritania, and it's almost as if the coverage is why do they do this? As if it's a bizarre phenomenon, as if the idea of wanting freedom and wanting just an end to a state of despair and a political, cultural, intellectual, spiritual asphyxiation, which is what the case is in most of these regimes across this region. I mean, it's a very sort of, it seems to me, yes, it's symbolic, but it's symbolic of a desire for freedom, which most Americans should and could identify with, if in fact, I think the Arabs are portrayed just as any other people, with positives and negatives, rather than always trying to figure out some kind of essential, aspect or depiction of them.
Well, I wonder if part of this is not an outgrowth of the burst of Islamophobia we've seen in the United States, even in the last year or two. I guess we seem to feel that, first of all, of course, all Arabs are Muslims and all Muslims are Arabs in our view. And essentially they're all enemies of the United States or backward. There's a remark, I don't think there's any region of the world where people are looked at so dismissively in the United States. And also all those reasons for the intense frustration and despair that is spreading in many Arab countries are not well appreciated in the outside world, particularly in the United States. And if I could put my finger on one in particular that you've mentioned a couple of times, the situation of Palestinians in Gaza and in the West Bank is something that, as you know, has caused intense anger throughout that region, not just in the Arab world, but in Turkey and elsewhere. But for Americans to understand that, to accept it, to realize how big an impact it has in the mind of Arabs, requires us to understand a little bit about how serious that situation is. And that requires us to reflect on our full support for Israel, and that's something that we're not psychologically prepared to do. Neuroscientists tell us that your brain is wired only to accept patterns that you're already familiar with. And when things happen that challenge those patterns, you automatically rewire them so that they fit into patterns you can recognize. If we are going to understand the intensity of anger that people in many Arab countries feel, we have to understand the depth of what is going on in Gaza and in the West Bank. And we don't want to understand that because of what that makes us rethink in terms of Israel.
Yeah, I think you're right. And I think the issue is also to understand that this anger is not directed at cultural forms in America. In other words, this is not an anger which is anti-American as such, but also it's about policies. It's about policies which are incredibly unfair, unjust, oppressive, and which are seen, as you know, if you follow the Arab world or follow Iran or follow Turkey. I mean, these news media follow and cover so many of these events that most Americans don't actually follow. And so it's really about understanding that the anger reflects a desire for justice. In other words, there is something positive, and there is a positive desire behind, at least a constructive desire behind so much of these protests, especially the mass protests, a desire for dignity, a desire for a better life for children, a better life, political freedom, liberation, self-determination. These are all things that Americans could identify with if they were just informed that these protests are not about antagonism to America as culture or American values, so-called. So I think, we have our work cut out for us, that's for sure.
I saw a great example of that in Turkey after the Mavi Marmara incident, when Israeli commandos stormed that ship that was trying to break the Gaza blockade. There was an outburst of anger in Washington at Turkey, saying that Turkey had switched sides. Turkey's now anti-Israel, anti-America. They've abandoned the West. This was all nonsense. What the motivation for Turkey's policy and for that Mavi Marmara expedition, among many other initiatives, was Turkey's increasing anger at what's going on with Palestinians, especially in Gaza. They are seeing this on their TV every night, and it's something Americans are so disconnected from. So it was easy for people in Washington to say that it just came out of nowhere, because we are not even aware, really, of what's going on in the West Bank and Gaza. And if the desire of the Mavi Marmara project was to focus more attention on that, boy, they succeeded in a tragic way beyond their wildest dreams.
Yeah, that they did. I mean, it was a terrible sort of set of events in terms of what the Israeli commandos did. But I think you're right. I mean, I think if Americans were to understand that the siege of Gaza is unconscionable, what's going on in Gaza, it's just unacceptable, and that the U.S. government and the Israeli government and, as you said, the Egyptian government are all complicit, and the PA for that matter. These are all complicit in this basically collective punishment of an entire population, which is besieged in any case, in this tiny strip of land, and basically with no future. And this is no way to conduct any kind of sane, rational, even medium-term policy of building a more constructive and a more positive Middle East. And so it's unconscionable what's going on in Gaza. What's going on in the West Bank in terms of the apartheid that you have there is also unacceptable. And I think most Americans, if they actually were to read about this or to see this or to actually look into this, would, I think, understand. I think most people in the world, I think, have a capacity to tell good from, right from wrong, good from bad. And I think the tragedy is that you do have right now an Israeli regime, Arab regimes, Iran in its own way, all these regimes which oppress the democratic aspirations of people in the region. And the United States, alas, oversees this. And the question is, how do you get that message across without without sensationalizing and without romanticism and without nationalism?
Well, this takes me as a journalist back to something I mentioned earlier, and that is I don't want to say collapse, but the deterioration of coverage of international news in the United States. There should be correspondence in Tunisia and in Gaza. It's a scandal that Al Jazeera provides better coverage of the world than any American television network. But the economics of mass journalism in the United States are driving us to a point where we don't even have the information we need to make judgments about parts of the world that are beyond our border. And that's dangerous, because although ignorance is always bad, I think American ignorance is even worse. If people in Paraguay don't know what's going on in the Middle East, that's their loss, that's unfortunate, but it doesn't really affect the course of events. With Americans, we act on our ignorance. Our ignorance has huge impact, because we're like this bull in the proverbial china shop. If we don't know what's going on, we can wreak huge havoc. So as a journalist, I'm always thinking about ways that we could begin to present these stories to Americans. And I think until we do that, it's hard to imagine that there'll be any popular pressure for changing policies.
Well, I think part of it also, I think you're right. I mean, part of the problem also has been this asphyxiating grasp of Arab regimes on sort of the politics in their respective countries. And so when in fact you do see, and this is the one hope that comes out of the Tunisian revolution, when and if in fact this revolution is able to sustain itself and there is real positive change on the ground institutionally in Tunisia, and you have a new generation. I mean, most of the Arab world's population, we're well over 300 million right now, it's basically a young population, and if they come to the fore and they're able to express their very human desires for liberation, for self-determination, for dignity, for education, for a better life, if all that is to happen, then maybe that will be a catalyst to at least begin to chip away at the sort of stereotypes of the Arab world, stereotypes that are sustained and fed, not just by American ignorance, as you said, but also by the fact that you have, clowns like Muammar al-Gaddafi in power in Libya, as well as these other sort of essentially monarchs, secular monarchs like Mubarak in Egypt and other places. I mean, there is some element of Arab agency, and I think Arabs, can and will, if given the opportunity, take their future in their own hands, hopefully.
Now, one reason that people in Iran are very unwilling to rise up in a violent way is that they remember what happened last time. Everybody was against the Shah, and they all agreed on one basic principle, which was that no matter what comes next, it's got to be better. And they learned a terrible lesson, that things could be worse. So history plays into this. So let me posit this question to you. We're talking about the effects of the upheaval in Tunisia on the rest of the Arab world. But wouldn't you agree, or would you say that a lot depends on what comes of this? If a reasonable, popular regime emerges that tries to make serious changes in Tunisia, maybe then the effect of what happened in Tunisia would spread to other countries. On the other hand, if Tunisia dissolves down into chaos or a new strong man emerges and nothing improves, maybe that would have the opposite effect, and it would help the autocratic regimes now in power in the Arab world. Do you see that possibly how this thing unfolds now in Tunisia over the coming weeks and months will have an even greater effect, perhaps, than the fact of the uprising itself?
Yeah, I think so. I mean, I think that goes without saying that a positive, real change on the ground in Tunisia will set an example. Hopefully, if that in fact does transpire on the ground. I think that the problem that we have in the Middle East is that you also have a U.S. role, an Iranian role, an Israeli role, all of which sort of play into this region one way or the other. And so the problem is how can this revolution itself alone shape this region? No, it can't, and because there's so many other sort of negative factors that are there that don't help the situation on the ground. Can we think of the Arab world without the fact that there is an American sort of presence, occupation in Iraq, in Afghanistan? Obviously, Afghanistan is not in the Arab world, but this massive presence in Afghanistan, this war in Afghanistan, the war in Iraq, the bombings in Yemen. All these things are also sort of negative factors. Will the Tunisian revolution be, as I said, a positive counterpush? Hopefully. And if it's a successful one, and if there really is a positive regime in Tunisia, you said reasonable. I mean, reasonable to be judged not by not by what Americans want, but by what people on the ground there want. If something happens there, then yes, I think it will have an impact. To what extent it'll be able to change things is of course, another question.
Well, it might be the first time we can remember that the Arab world is waiting on Tunisia. It wouldn't be the country we would have all picked. But Tunisia also, don't forget, Tunisia has its own deep history. I mean, I think the earliest constitutional regime in the Arab world was in Tunisia. It's got a secular law code. I mean, this has been an important country. Although I suspect that this revolution did take most people by surprise. Do you think that we are seeing somewhat of a reduction of the desire or willingness of outside powers to intervene in political processes in these countries? So obviously that desire is still high, but maybe not as high as it once was, and that the will in Paris and Washington and some other capitals to guarantee at all costs the survival of a certain regime is not as strong as it once was?
No, I think what you see is the parallels with the Iranian Revolution are interesting. I think the United States, in this case France as well, in the case of Tunisia, were completely taken aback by the rapidity and the speed at which the regime failed, and they were not prepared for a revolution. There was no I think preparation for this phase because it was so spontaneous. Because I think also Western regimes, the U.S., France, Britain, but especially the U.S., are simply so invested in the status quo that they weren't prepared for this kind of upheaval in Tunisia.
Now, let me take you across the Mediterranean to Lebanon. That's another country that is essentially spiraling into something new at the same time as Tunisia. Do you see them as in any way linked?
Well, I think exactly to follow up on the question that you asked earlier, Lebanon is a case in point where, in fact, you see, massive Western, in this case, American intervention in the internal affairs of Lebanon, but you also have Iranian intervention, you have Syrian, you have Israeli, you have all sorts of groups that are intervening in Lebanon. And so to answer your question, I don't think we're going to see less Western intervention. I mean, the U.S. props up regimes throughout the region still. The U.S. is engaged in a $60 billion arms sale to Saudi Arabia. And in Lebanon, I think you have a deeply divided country that is entirely open to various Arab security intelligence agencies that interfere in the country. As I said, you have a deeply divided population that can't agree on who is to lead them. You have a pro-Western grouping, and you have a pro-Hezbollah, pro-liberation, or pro-resistance is the word they use, pro-resistance grouping. And there is just no agreement there. So I think that opens up, the fact that there's no agreement opens up the space for Americans, French, Arab regimes, Israel, Iran, Syria to intervene.
Lebanon seems to be more of an arena for proxy wars and international forces than Tunisia. So maybe in that sense, Tunisia might be a little luckier and have more say over its own destiny.
Yeah, I mean, Lebanon is notorious in that respect. I mean, the Lebanese, it's not just their proxy wars. The Lebanese are also deeply divided, and it's a deeply sectarian form of politics in that country that goes back decades. And so, in that sense, the Lebanese are, in a sense, victims of the region, but they're also themselves participants in their own tragedy and their own downfall.
And would you say that many people in many Arab countries fall into the same category?
Of what?
Of being agents of their own troubles?
Well, I mean, to a greater and lesser extent, I mean, in the case of the Palestinians, it's obvious. The leadership of the Palestinian Authority is wretched. There's no, I don't think there's any way to gloss over that fact. But on the other hand, there are massive structural issues. I mean, there is an Israeli occupation, that's been going on for decades, and the United States is simply unable to change this reality. And in fact, it aids and abets Israel in its occupation of the West Bank, despite the fact that Obama has come out against settlement construction. But in the end, when push comes to shove, we see time and again that the U.S. administration backs down on this issue. So in the case of the Palestinians, yes, there is some agency, but not in circumstances of their choosing. And I guess you'd say that about all people in the region, probably in the world. I mean, all people have a certain amount, and that's what I think the Tunisian revolution, what it shows, is that yes, the situation can be wretched in some Arab countries. Yes, you can have a regime which has total control of the intelligence agencies, of the internal security forces, and it's totally repressive. It censors the press, and things look bleak and hopeless. And then in a matter of weeks, you can have profound change in a place like Tunisia. Lebanon, because the population is so divided, and it's not just regime against people, but it's actually people against people, because the government in Lebanon is so weak. I think it's a more difficult and complex case. In the case of the Palestinians, there's not even a state. There's a people who are under occupation and who are divided themselves between the PA and Hamas. And so in some parts, I think there's more scope for agency than others, but there's always agency.
Well, I guess I'm a little bit more reluctant at this point to look at what's happening in Tunisia as something that can be a success or a model for other countries. I think that's really premature. Maybe my experience in Iran has led me to be reluctant and to make me want to wait to see what emerges, because I still see the possibility that things could get could go really wrong in Tunisia. I mean, we had a good result in getting rid of the autocratic leader, but where do we go from here? I still think that's a very open question, and how that question is answered is going to determine whether Tunisia can be a model for something positive, or, as I said earlier, maybe it will be a model that will allow autocratic leaders in other Arab countries to say, look at the mess, the chaos into which Tunisia has descended. If you try to rebel against me, the same thing will happen here.
Yeah, I mean, of course, it all depends on what happens in Tunisia and whether the revolution is successful in actually, as I said from the beginning, fomenting positive, sustained change. But in terms of what the various Arab autocrats who rule most of the other Arab countries, regardless of what happens in Tunisia, they're going to repress their populations. And the question is, at what point will there be a set of circumstances that allow Egyptians, for example, to finally get rid of an incredibly repressive, corrupt regime in Egypt? And so that, of course, we wait to see. But until U.S. policy changes, the tragedy is that it's not just the Arabs and what they want, and it's also a broken, I think, U.S. policy in the region, which supports injustice in many instances against the desire, I think, of most people, including most Americans, if they knew, for a more positive development in the region.
I think one of the reasons that Turkey has emerged as such a leader in that part of the world is that there's such a leadership vacuum. Other countries that might be regional leaders like Iran, Iraq, Egypt, certainly, are so consumed with their own domestic problems that they're not able to be an example to anyone anymore. I think the Arab world really is looking for a success story. They desperately need something to point to, a model, an example, an encouragement. And I think that could be the most positive thing that would come out of Tunisia if things go well there. But I still feel we have to wait and see if that's going to happen.
Well, let's wait and see. But I mean, again, you're right. I mean, the issue, of course, is that the Americans, who had a certain amount of leadership in this part of the world, have basically abdicated their leadership role in any positive, constructive sense. And what you have is Turkey filling in a vacuum left by a lack of American leadership, or just American leadership which has been catastrophic in terms of war, fomenting wars in the region. And then, of course, the Arab leaders have all but abdicated their responsibility for any kind of leadership. And they're collectively, I think, a disgrace. And Turkey, at least in terms of the way it's talking in the Arab world, is offering, and not just Turkey, I mean, Hezbollah, Hassan Nasrallah to an extent, and is also offering people who follow him, again, this precisely what Turkey is also offering, which is leadership in a time of crisis.
Well, I think you do see, when you look at the forces and who bets on them, a real imbalance in popularity. Iran is betting on forces like Hamas, Hezbollah, Shiite parties in Iraq. These are forces that are popular. They win elections. America is betting on Pharaoh regime in Egypt, Mahmoud Abbas and the PA, and increasingly radical politicians in Israel. Over the long run, it's easy to see how Iranians are feeling more positive about the future and their ability to win a kind of jousting contest with the United States in that part of the world.
Correct, but the tragedy of that scenario is that while there's no doubt that most of the popular regime or movements, shall we say, most of the popular movements, most of the representative movements in the region are basically towing a line that's not subservient to the U.S. The problem is that in the end, you can't ignore the U.S. I mean, we said this in the beginning. The U.S. plays a critical role in this region. And so the negative spoiling factor is what is ultimately worrying. Because in the end, I mean, Iran has its own interests. I mean, Iran's interests are not necessarily the interests of the Arab people. And so what you have is an Iranian, U.S., Israeli sort of triangle in which you have, right now, you don't actually, and you, as you said, Turkey, you don't have any Arab sort of counterpart to these. And that's really the tragedy of this region, that you have all these other powers who are intervening precisely because the Arab leaderships have all abdicated their responsibility to lead this region.
I think that's very true, and you certainly see that as one of the reasons for Turkey's emergence. Let me ask you this. Do you see any outside countries or forces that have played, are playing, or could potentially play a positive role in Tunisia?
Well, I mean, of course, you've had tremendous support across the region, popular support across the region. Do you mean foreign countries? I mean, non-Arab
Yes.
countries?
Yes, or even non-Arab countries, even from Europe or beyond.
Yeah, I think most countries in the world are looking to see what's going to happen in Tunisia. How do these events unfold? What will happen in this transitional period before what is presumably going to be and hopefully will be free elections in Tunisia? And as I said, the basis for real positive institutional legal changes in Tunisia. I think most people are waiting to see, because again, the events in Tunisia prove that ultimately, regardless of what the various interests are, when a population finally mobilizes, it has its own power. But I think most people are waiting to see, and most regimes, for that matter, in the Arab world are also waiting to see. And I think most Arab dictators are nervous about the situation in Tunisia.
But just the fact that they're waiting to see is something new and positive. If this was 25 years ago, wouldn't you agree that the French paratroopers would have already landed long ago in Tunisia?
I don't know what would have happened 25 years ago. I know that that time, I think, is over in terms of that aspect of French hegemony in the region is over. And the question is, what ultimately is going to happen on the ground in terms of this Arab aspiration, which has been there for over a century now, for self-determination, and who is going to ultimately fulfill this aspiration for self-determination, and on what terms, and in what language. And I think that's what we will see.
Well, also what you say about it having been there for 100 years is really true, and I think that does feed some of the media skepticism, or even desire in the early stages in Tunisia of the media not even to cover the thing. They feel like this has been going on forever. Yeah, Arabs have always been saying they're unhappy, and they've always been autocratic leaders, and we've been told 100 times that this is going to change soon, but it never does. I guess ultimately it will sometime, but it's always hard to convince cynical journalists and others that this is the moment when something's going to happen that hasn't happened for 100 years.
Well, I mean, but keep in mind, I mean, what we're talking about is ultimately a region which has changed profoundly in 100 years. I mean, before World War I, this was part of the Ottoman Empire. After World War I, you had basically colonial states that were created by the British and the French. And then you had the creation of Israel at the expense of the Palestinians in 1948. And then you had massive revolutions, secular revolutions, in many Arab states, and secular Arab nationalism really arose as a force in the 1950s. You had the Cold War. Then you had this period after, I think, the demise of secular Arab nationalism, which, you know, on the one hand, it had its own internal failures. On the other hand, was sort of had a war waged against it by U.S. policy, effectively, as well as by Israel, and that ultimately you ended up having this phase that we've had for 30 odd years, more, even longer in some cases, of national security regimes which don't speak which ostensibly speak in the name of the people, but are incredibly corrupt, incredibly repressive, incredibly unrepresentative. And it's this period, this latest period, where of regimes which have totally lost touch with their people. And Gaddafi, I think, is the greatest example of this. If you saw what he said just last week or this week about Tunisia, I mean, it's unbelievable to listen to a leader like Gaddafi get up there and lecture the Tunisians on their sort of their uppityness, basically, with the fact that they took their own political will in their own hands, and they rebelled against tyranny, and he's opposed to that rebellion against tyranny because, of course, he's a tyrant himself. And so I think what you have now is hopefully the beginning of the end of this most depressing phase of modern Arab history. But that phase is a phase, and it's a limited phase, historically speaking. We're talking about decades, not a century.
It's true. Of course, America has this very short-term view of the world. We don't see history beyond a period of weeks or months. I do think that there's one interesting way in which the world, or Tunisians' understanding of the world, did shape recent events, and it had to do with the WikiLeaks aspect of this Tunisian uprising. As you know, some of the WikiLeaks cables were about Tunisia, and they showed that American diplomats were very scornful of the Ben Ali regime and totally aware of its corrupt nature. Now, from what I've heard from my Tunisian friends, the publication of those cables did not tell the Tunisians anything that they didn't already know. All those specific acts of corruption in the family and so forth that were reported in those WikiLeaks cables were well known in Tunisia. But what the Tunisians did not understand and did not realize until they saw those cables was that we're not the only ones who see this. The outside world knows this too. And I wonder if that wasn't some kind of a small factor in giving them the self-confidence to act.
Well, that's speculation. I don't know. Maybe. I mean, if that's the case, then we should look forward to revolutions across the Arab world, because the WikiLeaks were not just about Tunisia, but about the state of despair and political bankruptcy in most Arab regimes that are subservient to the United States. And so if that is in fact the case, that WikiLeaks helped usher in a revolution, I don't think that really is the case. But if that were the case, then hopefully we'll see more revolutions across the Arab world, because God knows this region does in fact need change, positive change, and sooner rather than later.
And you know, one thing I do extract from those WikiLeaks cables is something that I've seen often before, and that is that American diplomats in the region, in these regions, including in the Middle East, and Americans who are working on geopolitics and geostrategy for a living, including people in the CIA and the Defense Intelligence Agency, they all understand this. They understand what we're talking about. The problem is not with the specialists. The problem is with the politicians, the policymakers who respond to and then help shape public opinion, partly for reasons of the pathologies of American domestic politics, which we've talked about indirectly. There is a tremendous pull toward the traditional consensus in Washington. And anybody that has an original outlook is immediately stigmatized as somebody who doesn't get the basic facts. We do have this feeling in America that we're really the only ones who get the Middle East, that nobody else in the world gets it, and even the people that live there, the countries in the region, they don't get it either. Only we understand it. But when you get below that demagoguery that comes from the political policymakers, and you get down to the people that are specialists, and I think you see this in the WikiLeaks cables, they all understand what is seething in the Arab world and where it's coming from and how legitimate it is. So I think that is something that may have an effect on Arab consciousness.
Maybe. I mean, yeah, but I think the issue is the Arabs have never had, I don't think, an issue with Americans as individuals, and certainly not with Americans who know something about the Arab world. And you're right, of course, in many instances, I wouldn't say every instance, but in many instances, American diplomats do, of course, know a lot about the region, and American policy, analysts, academics, others, of course, they know a lot about the region. Journalists who actually specialize on the region do know a lot about the region, and certainly know more than the sort of demagogic policymaker, the people who set policy. But ultimately, the issue in the Arab world is not. I think people understand that individual Americans know something and can know something about the Arab world. The issue is, will these policies that we agree are repressive and ultimately very counterproductive to American interests, if we just consider the fact that in the end we all live in the same world, and the United States has to, and it's in the United States' interest to have a positive development in the Middle East rather than a seething rage in this part of the world. Will there be real change to American foreign policy, and how do we actually affect that change? How do we get to a point where we actually have real policy shift in this country. And I think that's a question where the Arabs can play a part, but not the only part.
I sometimes wonder if it wouldn't be positive for us to frame this in a way that would also include a feeling that if we want to protect Israel over the long run, going along with the policies that the current Israeli regime follows is a bad avenue. In the long run, Israel is not going to be able to defend itself militarily forever. It's going to have to, if it's in a region of seething anger and hatred, that is really a long-term security threat to Israel. And so therefore, maybe Americans can be led to understand that just like you don't let your friends drive drunk, if you consider Israel an ally and you want to secure it over the long-term future, allowing it to continue to follow policies that create the very instability that is the greatest long-term threat to Israeli security is actually not good for Israel. That would, of course, require us to say that we see Israeli security needs in the long term differently from the way current Israeli leaders do, and that might be difficult. Nonetheless, I do think it's legitimate to say that even if you want to defend Israel over the long run, that's a very good reason to have major changes in American Middle East policy right now.
Yeah, we definitely need sort of major changes in American foreign policy. And I think also what we need is a change ultimately in the discourse. I think this will, in terms of how we conceptualize the Middle East, how we think about Israel, how we think about the Arab world, how we think about security, not as something that's Israeli only, but it has to be joint ultimately in terms of, and secularism has to be true secularism across the region. And so, and an emphasis on human rights for all people. I think that's where we need to sort of emphasize. But I think that's not going to come from the government straight. It's going to have to work its way up, I think, gradually, as more and more people hopefully become better acquainted with the Middle East, with the realities of that region. I think we can see positive change, although, it's a very long road ahead. And here I think I'm being more romantic than realistic. But I think there is no question that U.S. policy towards Israel and the Palestinians is a catastrophe right now. It's horrendous to the Palestinians, and it's also not good for any Israeli who wants to have a secular, rational, sane future.
We maintain such a list of factions and countries that we won't talk to.
Yeah.
Iran cannot be a partner to any Middle East peace deal. Hamas cannot be a partner. Hezbollah cannot be a partner. We're essentially ruling out some of the most popular forces that absolutely must be included, whether you like them or not.
Well, I think this is the problem of an Israel-centric policy in the region. It can't be that. It has to be a policy that takes the region as a whole, with the populations of that region into consideration. And so there is no reason not to engage with enemies or purported enemies. There is no reason not to engage with people who, at least who are genuine political actors with representative constituencies, in that part of the world. I mean, I think that's a rational way of conducting foreign policy. And in fact, inevitably that's going to happen. I mean, you can't just ignore a reality. Eventually it's going to, come back and impose itself.
This question of engagement, I think, is really central. We developed this mindset in the United States that engagement itself, just talking and discussion, is a concession. And you have to behave well before we agree to talk to you. But actually, you don't need to negotiate with your friends. You already agree with them. It's precisely those countries and factions and groups with which you disagree that you've got to talk to. Now I noticed that the new incoming chairwoman of the House Foreign Affairs Committee has denounced the Obama administration for sending an ambassador to Syria. And she said that this is a huge concession to the Syrian regime. How do we get into this mindset that just having an ambassador to speak to someone amounts to a concession? In fact, that's an absolute precondition for improved relations.
Yeah, we agree on that point, 100%. How we change that? I mean, that's a question of the political process in this country, obviously, and that's a lot of work. And I think it's it's crucial. It's essential to any kind of sane foreign policy that we're going to develop. But how that's going to happen is certainly not clear to me, given precisely these kinds of frankly, irrational statements.
One aspect of this that I've also seen as a limiting factor that paralyzes American diplomatic imagination, even beyond Israel and oil, is one that isn't often mentioned. You mentioned briefly this arms sale, which is now, I think, the biggest arms sale in the history of the human race, $60 billion of American weaponry going to Saudi Arabia. Now, the arms manufacturers in the United States that receive those huge contracts very cleverly divide them up and make sure that there are factories in the districts of every important congressman and senator making pieces of those planes and tanks and guidance systems and so forth. It takes a very brave American politician, particularly at this time in our economic history, to get up and say, those tens of thousands of jobs that Saudi arms purchases are creating in the United States are jobs we don't want. That's a bad investment. I feel that this is a very important hold that Saudi Arabia and the Arab establishment has on the American political process.
Well, how so exactly, in terms of?
Because it makes it impossible for members of Congress to vote to do things that Saudi Arabia and its allies won't like. That means maybe Saudi Arabia will take its business elsewhere. They won't be buying so many of our weapons. We're going to be losing jobs if we don't follow King Abdullah's advice and go out and cut off the head of the snake. So I think that these arms purchases and the way they have captured the support of important members of Congress constitute a very difficult obstacle for changing American foreign policy in the Middle East.
Although I think it's the other way around. I think it's the Saudis are buying from the United States is a reflection, I think, of the clientelism of the Saudis to the United States. I mean, this is a recycling of petrodollars in weapons systems that the Saudis, in all likelihood, will never use. And the corruption is intense in terms of the kickbacks that no doubt went along with this kind of massive arms deal. I think that is the problem. I don't think the Saudi establishment or the Arab establishment, so-called, I think actually exists in terms of exerting any kind of meaningful pressure on the U.S. I think, in fact, if anything, this is just an example, the latest example of the tremendous corruption inherent in the recycling of petrodollars from the Arab states in the Western economies, especially through arms deals that benefit no people in the region other than a tiny group that benefits and makes an extraordinary amount of money off various kickbacks. And I think that's the tragedy of this weapons deal, is that rather than investing in their own people and in people across the region, they're investing in these military systems, weapon systems that are utterly useless in terms of actually doing anything on the ground to improve the economy, the welfare, the health systems of these countries.
But yet those arms purchases do bolster the economy of the United States. And
yeah, of course. I mean, that's what I said. That's what I mean by recycling of petrodollars. But I don't think the Saudis have any kind of real leverage. I mean, it seems to me the Saudis are a client regime of the Saudi regime is a client regime of the U.S. in this respect. And it basically now understands that popular will in the region is ranged against it. And as a result, it's allied itself with the various other repressive regimes in the region, including Israel and Egypt, in opposition to any kind of progressive democratic force for change. And I think this arms deal is just another indication that the U.S., where real U.S. policy actually is, as opposed to U.S. rhetoric, unfortunately.
I think you're right that to think of these regimes as being some are secular and some are more religious is a mistaken dichotomy. Or some are more pro-Israel, some are more anti-Israel. That's also a mistaken dichotomy. The real dichotomy is there's a group of regimes that all together have the interests of repressing popular sentiment, and they all support each other because they realize if one goes down, it's difficult for all of them. And I think maybe that's what the Tunisia situation represents. I would ask you, if I were to tell you that within a year or two, there's going to be a Tunisia-like scenario in one more Arab country, Where would you think it might be?
You know, that speculation, of course, but my hope would be, I mean, it would be every Arab country, but if it were to be one country, I think everyone agrees it would ideally be Egypt. I mean, the most populous Arab country, a tremendous influence in terms of shaping the political present and future of the Arab world. Egypt would be key, and Egypt has a heritage of course, it's the country of Gamal Abdel Nasser. It's a country which did in fact at one point lead the Arab world, and today is stuck in the mire of dictatorship. And so hopefully, that it would be Egypt. But of course, you know, one hopes for positive change across the region. One hopes for positive change in every state in the region, because it's such a dire picture. Other than this blast of hope from Tunisia, we don't even know where that's going to end up even. So, what
do you think are the prospects for change in Saudi Arabia?
You know, again, it's each country has its specificities and has its sort of its context, its moment, its specific politics. And I think in Saudi Arabia, again, you have tremendous discontent with the regime, but you have also vested interests in the regime. And the problem, of course, in Saudi Arabia is that you don't have a secular discourse there. So the question is, but you do have the same kind of basic divisions, repressive regime and forces of opposition trying to sort of break out from this repressive. But I don't know what's going to happen. Honestly, it's such a difficult thing to predict in terms of Saudi Arabia or any other country. But if there were to be one sort of change, one would hope that it would be across the region as a whole.
Well, I think that's a good segue to our next conversation a year or two from now. Let's look back and see how this all played out.
All right. Take care. Bye-bye.
Thank you. Bye.